Hello students! Today we will start a new topic, genetics. This is a topic which all of you have studied before, so I'm hoping that most of the content in this lecture is review. After we review today, we will add more to your understanding of genetics concepts in the coming days. Let's get started. We all know that every individual has a particular set of traits. A trait is a specific characteristic, such as eye color or height, that varies from one individual to another. We also know from our last section on meiosis that all of an organism's traits are inherited from its parents. We call this passing on of traits from parents to offspring heredity. You can see in this picture that the traits of the children are similar to the traits of their parents. They have similar hair and eye color, as well as the shapes of their noses and the shapes of their smiles. And even if we were able to interact with them, we might notice behavioral traits as well that are common between the parents and the children. We can study how traits are passed down from one generation to the next to create new offspring with specific and unique combinations of traits. This type of study, or the study of heredity, is called genetics. And that's what we'll be studying in this section. As we begin our study, we will have to keep in mind something we've learned in the previous section, and that is that the nitrogen base sequences in the alleles the organism inherits is what actually determines the organism's traits. So, we will be focusing a lot on the alleles that parents carry and how specifically those alleles get passed down to their children. All right, so let's start by defining genetics as the study of how traits are inherited through the interaction of alleles. We're going to make sure to note that this term interaction is important, as it indicates that we're going to have to look at how the alleles that you inherited from both parents affect each other, and how you end up expressing the trait as a result of the two alleles that you inherit. But before we get there, we're going to start by doing a little bit of review about the origin of genetics as a scientific discipline. So let's go back in time to about the mid-1800s and reacquaint ourselves with Gregor Mendel, who today is considered, quote, the father of genetics, because he was the first to study and come up with a meaningful explanation about how traits are inherited. So, who was Gregor Mendel? Mendel was an Austrian monk who was also a scientist, mathematician, and an avid gardener. Since he spent a lot of time in the garden, and because he was an observant person, he started to notice that the plants that he took care of, that even if they were the same species, they could have a surprisingly wide variety of traits. He became curious about what caused plants of the same species to have different traits, such as different flower colors, different seed shapes, different heights, etc. Like you see in the pictures here. All of these pictures, you can kind of see some of the different traits that he noticed in pea plants. His curiosity led him to conduct 8 years worth of experiments that now, a century and a half later, still form the basis of our understanding of genetics. So, we're going to look at the experiments that Mendel conducted to see how he was able to come to his conclusions about how traits are inherited. As many of you know, Mendel's choice organism for studying inheritance was the pea plant. So if we're going to understand his experiments, let's remind ourselves a little bit about how plants reproduce. Just as we know today, Mendel was able to see that the variations in pea plants were passed on to offspring through pollination. as a review, the term pollination refers to the transfer of pollen from the male reproductive structure, or the stamen, to the female reproductive structure, which is the carpel. So if I were going to remind you, this is probably about a quarter ago that we did this. Here's the male reproductive structure, and the female reproductive structure, the carpel, can be found here. And so in order for fertilization to occur and for offspring to be made, we had to have a way to get the pollen, which is produced here. Let me maybe change colors so you can see that a little better. The pollen that is produced here on the end of the stamen needs to be somehow transferred to the carpel. Recall that once that pollen is transferred, then fertilization can take place when that pollen grain containing the sperm actually has to tunnel down to the ovary and fuse with an egg. And so we see that here in this diagram. Any sperm containing pollen, once it is attached to the carpel, it's going to tunnel all the way down to the bottom, and it's going to fertilize eggs that are there in the ovary. Something I mentioned earlier in the year when we studied plants, but I'll state more specifically now, is that pollination can occur in two ways. The first is something called self-pollination, which is the transfer of pollen from the stamen to the stigma of a flower on the same plant. The stigma, I probably should have used a different word. The stigma is just one part of the carpel, the part of the carpel that sticks up. And so we can see that here in this example, the pollen would be maybe on this flower, and it's transferred to another flower on the same plant. Or even can be the pollen from one flower transferred to itself, to its own carpel. Mendel noticed that if any plant was allowed to self-pollinate, it would produce offspring with the same characteristics. So, for example, if your plant was originally tall, then the offspring made as a result of self-pollination would also be tall. So by self-pollinating plants generation after generation, Mendel could produce pea plants with characteristics that were predictable and unvarying. The other type of pollination is cross-pollination, which is the transfer of pollen from the flower of one plant to the flower of a different plant, which has a different genetic composition, and thus different traits. And so we can see that here, if you take pollen from this plant and it's transferred all the way over to another plant, which maybe does not have the same characteristics, this would be cross-pollination. So Mendel already knew how self-pollination could enable him to predict traits, but he wanted to see what would happen if he cross-pollinated between two plants that had different characteristics. For instance, if he took pollen from a tall plant and cross-pollinated it with a short plant, or from a green, a plant that produced green pea pods and transfer it to a plant that had yellow pea pods, and so on. And so we're actually going to take a look at some of those experiments that Mendel conducted right now. All right, so here's the setup that Mendel used to study inheritance of traits in offspring that are produced from the cross-pollination of plants that had different expressions of the trait. For example, if the trait was height, then Mendel would choose one tall plant and cross-pollinate it with a plant that had the opposite expression of that trait, in this case, a short plant. Whenever he did this, he would get a first generation of offspring that all looked like one of the two parents. So, for example, even though only one parent here is tall, we've got these two parents, there's only one parent that is tall, all of the offspring in the second generation are tall. So we see that here. Here's our second generation. They're all tall. Even though they have a short parent, none of them came out short. In the next step of his experiments, Mendel would take the plants made in the first generation, and he would then cross-pollinate them. So we can see here, this X here means cross-pollinate. So he took these two first generation of offspring plants, and he cross-pollinated them. And interestingly, in the second generation, no matter what trait he was studying, whether it was height or pea pod color or flower color, he would always find the traits appearing in a 3-to-1 ratio. So for example, we see here that even though all the parents of these offspring are tall, we've got 75% of them, which are tall like their parents, but now all of a sudden, so we've got one, not that. We've got 3 here that are tall like their parents, but we've got this other one now. There's the 3-to-1 ratio. We've got this other one who, even though its parents aren't short, it came out short. So the question then is, why did this short trait seem to reappear in this second generation? What explains this? What explains the fact that we got 3 tall and 1 short? And how did Mendel explain this? So, after observing this pattern in many experiments, Mendel was able to conclude that every trait was controlled by 2 factors, and that some of those factors are dominant, while others are recessive. Now, although Mendel was working before the discovery of DNA and genes, today we know that the, quote, factors that Mendel discovered are actually alleles. And so a dominant allele is an allele that masks the effect of the other allele when both are present in the same cell or organism. As we go forward, we will represent dominant alleles with a capital letter. On the other hand, recessive alleles are alleles whose effect is masked when paired with a dominant allele, and only expressed when paired with another recessive allele. Going forward, we will represent recessive alleles with lowercase letters. So you can see that, actually, you know what, I'm not going to explain this diagram yet because I want to go to the next slide where we're going to reinterpret Mendel's results. Okay, so here we are. Let's see if we can now explain why Mendel made these observations with the pea plants, where the first generation of offspring were all one type, but the second generation occurred in a 3-to-1 ratio. All right, so we've got our trait, its height, but now we know that that trait is actually controlled by 2 factors: a dominant allele, which we'll represent with a capital H, and a recessive allele, which we'll represent with a lowercase h. So if we're looking at these 2 alleles, we know the dominant allele is going to give you the tall trait, and the recessive allele is going to give you the short trait. So applying this to our original parents, our parental generation, the ones we started with, we know that the tall parent is going to have a combination of alleles in which both alleles are dominant, while the short one will have a combination in which both alleles are recessive. Now, recall that we said that in the first generation, which we will call F1, all of the pea plants were tall. It seemed like the factor that caused the plants to be short had disappeared. But what really happened? Did that factor in fact disappear? The answer is that we have to remember that when these plants, these parent plants, reproduce, they're diploid plants, but when they reproduce, they need to make gametes. And we know that gametes are haploid. So this parent can give one of its alleles to its offspring, but not both, because the other parent also has to give one allele, but not both. And so what will happen here is that the resulting offspring, since it can only receive half of one of its parents' DNA and the other half of its other parent's DNA, the resulting allele combination is that these are going to have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. This one as well. It's got to have one dominant allele and one recessive allele, because that's the only combination that's possible if it's going to receive half from one parent and half from the other. Now, since the dominant allele will mask the recessive allele, in all of these cases, these are going to appear tall. Even though they're carrying inside their DNA an allele to be short, that allele is recessive. And so every single offspring that will be made will be tall. All right, so now we've got to apply the same rules in the next generation. When the F1 plants are bred, so these ones here, when we crossbreed these together, again, each parent can only give half of its DNA for making the gametes. And so we can actually determine all of the possible combinations of alleles that can be donated by the parents. And so I've got this color-coded to hopefully help you see what's going on. The first possible combination that can occur is that parent number 1 can give its dominant allele, and parent number 2 can give its dominant allele. So you're going to get the first combination looking like this, and that, of course, is going to give you a tall plant. The second possibility is that the first parent can give its dominant allele, but then the second parent gives its recessive allele. In this case, because there is a dominant allele, it will mask the recessive allele, and this offspring will also appear tall. The third possibility is that the first parent can give its recessive allele, and the second parent can give its dominant allele. So we see that here, it's the same combination, but just inherited in the opposite way. And again, in this third possibility, we have a third chance to be tall, because that dominant allele will overpower the recessive allele. Finally, the last possible way we can combine half of the alleles from each parent is to say the first parent gives its recessive allele and the second parent also gives its recessive allele. In this case, which will happen 1 out of 4 times, we've got a combination of alleles that will make the plant short. So this is where we've got that short trait appearing again, even though its parents are both tall, both parents are carrying at least one recessive allele, and there's a 25% chance that an offspring will inherit both alleles from that parent. I got 25% out of this. There's 3 here. This is a 3-to-1 ratio of the offspring, 3 tall to 1 short, or 3 out of 4, meaning this will occur 75% of the time, and the other 25% of the time, you'll get this combination. All right, so those are Mendel's experiments. Next time we're going to take a look at how we can use Mendel's finding to predict allele combinations that offspring can inherit. We'll use Punnett squares for this, so bring your math and problem solving skills to class next time I see you. All right, see you then.